The Disappearance, Liverpool, May 2020, a quiet side street in the suburbs. No police sirens, no broken doors, just an unremarkable house tucked between rows of semi-detached homes. Inside that house, 30 kilograms of cocaine were stacked like bricks, sealed, clean, ready for distribution. But overnight the stash vanished. No alarms went off, no witnesses came forward, and no one, not the police, not the neighbors, even knew a crime had occurred. Yet in the shadows of Liverpool's criminal underworld, the message was clear. Someone had just robbed one of the most feared firms in the city and lived to tell the tale. The stolen drugs had a street value of over £1 million, and they didn't belong to just anyone. They belonged to the Huyton Firm, a ruthless drug syndicate with decades of dominance in Merseyside, the kind of group you don't cross, ever. What followed wasn't a police investigation, it was a manhunt. Brutal, immediate, and totally off the books. Within hours, encrypted messages lit up the dark web. Phones buzzed across Liverpool. EncroChat, the criminal world's favorite messaging app, lit up with threats, blackmail, and kill orders. There were no second chances. Someone would pay for this. And someone did, just not the right person. In the first few days, rumors spread like wildfire. The firm got hit. The stash house was cleared out. They know who did it. But the truth was murkier. The actual culprits, a small crew of criminals with inside knowledge, had disappeared without a trace. No fingerprints, no slip-ups, no heat. It was almost surgical. In the absence of answers, the firm did what violent crews always do. They made assumptions. And those assumptions would nearly destroy an innocent family. At the center of it all stood a man named Brian Maxwell Sr., a middle-aged father from Kirkby with no real ties to the drug world except for one, his son Robbie, a troubled young man, addicted, broke, and recently overheard talking about a big opportunity. That was enough. By the time the firm put two and two together, rightly or wrongly, the message had already gone out. We want our gear back, or we want bodies. What began as a silent robbery would explode into one of the most dangerous manhunts in recent UK history. No police involvement, no due process, just raw, unfiltered retaliation. And in the middle of it all, a father trying to save his son's life from the city's most feared criminals, the Huyton Firm. To understand the storm that was about to unfold, you have to understand the men behind the name, the Huyton Firm. They weren't just a drug gang, they were an institution. Born out of Cantrell Farm, one of Liverpool's most deprived and volatile housing estates, the Huyton Firm rose from the ashes of post-industrial poverty. The estate was built in the 1960s to house thousands of displaced residents. But by the 1980s, it had become a no-go zone, a breeding ground for crime, addiction, and unemployment. In that chaos, a new order emerged. The firm built its empire slowly. Heroin, crack, cannabis, whatever sold, whatever corrupted. But it wasn't just the drugs, it was the fear, the intimidation, the reputation that made witnesses forget, that kept police second-guessing, that turned silence into currency. By the 2000s, the Huyton Firm had gone professional. Their operations were structured, their lieutenants well-paid, and their logistics military-grade. Bulk importation from Spain and the Netherlands. Couriers trained to avoid heat. Burners replaced weekly. Encrypted phones used religiously. At the center of it all stood a man known only as Dickie. Real name, Vincent Coggins. Mid-30s, calculated, charismatic, and utterly merciless. Coggins wasn't the kind of boss who flaunted his power. He didn't need to. His orders were obeyed, his debts were paid, and his enemies disappeared, one way or another. He surrounded himself with a tight inner circle. Paul Woodford, his right-hand man, known for his brutal enforcement style. Edward Bobby Jarvis, a reliable fixer with links across the Northwest. Michael Earl, Craig Cox, and Richard Caswell, all trusted foot soldiers who knew how to make problems disappear. Together, they ran a network that spanned Merseyside, Cheshire, Manchester, and parts of Wales. Cocaine was their currency, but fear was their weapon. They didn't just control supply, they controlled the streets. Competitors fell in line or fell off the map. And when there was a score to settle, they didn't hesitate. Which is why, when their £1,000,000 stash disappeared, they didn't wait for facts. They reacted with force. EncroChat messages flew back and forth between devices, code names, drop locations, surveillance photos, threats, orders, and at the top of every thread, one name appeared again and again: Maxwell. Whether or not he'd taken anything didn't matter. The firm had declared him guilty, and in their world, guilt came with only one sentence: a father's mistake. Brian Maxwell Sr. wasn't a criminal. He was a working-class father from Kirkby, barely scraping by, doing what he could to hold his fractured family together. But his son Robbie was another story. By 2020, Robbie Maxwell had become a problem no father knew how to fix. In and out of addiction, small-time dealing, bouncing between couches and debts. His life was spiraling, fast. And though Brian had tried to pull him back countless times, the boy kept slipping deeper into a world Brian didn't understand. So when Robbie came home one night, excited, nervous, and muttering something about sorting everything out, Brian didn't think much of it. He should have. Within days of the £1,000,000 cocaine robbery, the name Maxwell was being whispered in the encrypted corners of EncroChat. The firm didn't know exactly who had taken the stash, but they'd heard just enough to build a theory. Robbie was broke. Robbie owed people. Robbie had loose lips. It didn't take long for suspicion to land. But the real pressure began when Brian received a knock at his door. Not from the police, but from men who didn't need to show ID. Men who asked quiet questions with hard eyes. Who reminded him of favors unpaid, of rumors floating, of what happens when people mess with the wrong crew. He panicked. In a desperate attempt to buy time, or perhaps mercy, Brian made a call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He confessed. Not to the police, to the firm. He told them his son had done it, that he was sorry, that he would make it right, that he would pay. "I'll get the money," he said, "just don't hurt him." It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Brian didn't realize that the firm wasn't looking for an apology. They were looking for blood. His confession sealed his son's fate, and his own. EncroChat messages show what happened next in brutal clarity. Kill orders were issued. Surveillance was launched. Cars were followed. Robbie was targeted. And Brian, now entangled in something he couldn't escape, began liquidating everything he had. He sold his home. He emptied his savings. He borrowed against everything, all to come up with the price the firm demanded, £1.3 million. It was the cost of his son's life. But even that wasn't a guarantee, because by now the firm didn't just want repayment. They wanted revenge, and they were preparing to take it 4 times over. 4 dead men. Inside the encrypted walls of EncroChat, a storm was building. Messages between high-level gang members in the Huyton Firm weren't just angry, they were murderous. Cold, detailed, and deliberate. They weren't asking if someone would die. They were deciding who, when, and how. Vincent "Dickie" Coggins, furious over the theft and paranoid about weakness in his ranks, wanted to send a message to his enemies and his own crew. They think they can rob us and walk away? We'll have 4 bodies before the week's out. He wasn't bluffing. According to the recovered messages later presented in court, the firm had drawn up a kill list. 4 targets they believed were involved in the robbery, or knew who was. The names were repeated in multiple threads. They were being tracked, watched, their routines documented. This was no random street violence. This was organized murder in the making. Weapons were sourced, drop cars arranged, face masks, gloves, changes of clothes, even acid disposal was discussed. One message read simply, "Dead men tell no tales." At the center of this kill order, Robbie Maxwell, and 3 other men loosely connected to him. None of them had been caught red-handed. None had been proven guilty. But guilt didn't matter to the firm. Brian Maxwell Sr., meanwhile, was racing against time. The more he paid, the more they demanded. The more he pleaded, the colder the replies became. He offered £50,000, then £150,000, eventually promising the full £1.3 million. But it was clear. They weren't just collecting a debt. They were exerting power, psychological warfare, dominance, fear. By this point, Coggins and his crew were drunk on the hunt. One message described how they'd do him on the spot. Another joked about feeding rats. They wanted to make examples, and they wanted it seen. Police weren't even in the picture. The threat was coming from the inside, from a criminal world that policed itself with blood. But what no one in the firm knew was that the very tool they relied on to plan this massacre, EncroChat, had already been compromised. In secret, a European cyber task force, working with UK's National Crime Agency, had cracked into EncroChat months earlier. Every message, every threat, every order was being recorded in real time. And what they were seeing was horrifying. 4 men, completely unaware, were walking around with invisible crosshairs on their backs. The manhunt was real, and it was days away from turning deadly. Operation Venetic. The Huyton Firm believed they were untouchable. For years, they had operated with precision, discipline, and near-mythical fear. Their messages were encrypted, their orders buried behind fake names and burner phones. Their network spread across counties, and nobody talked. But they didn't know they were being watched. Thousands of miles away, in France, cybercrime specialists had pulled off one of the most ambitious surveillance operations in modern law enforcement history. They'd managed to infiltrate EncroChat, the secure messaging platform used by over 60,000 criminals worldwide, including Britain's most dangerous gangs. The breach was surgical. For months, French intelligence quietly mirrored every message sent through the network, in real time, and passed that data to agencies across Europe. In the UK, this secret surveillance became Operation Venetic, a joint effort between the National Crime Agency, NCA, and regional organized crime units, including Merseyside Police and the Northwest Regional Organized Crime Unit, NWROQ. When analysts began reading the messages coming out of Liverpool, alarm bells rang immediately. Death threats, kill lists, ransom demands, drug movements by the kilo, hit orders, torture instructions, addresses, license plates, surveillance photos, and right in the middle, the Huyton Firm. Police couldn't believe what they were seeing. It wasn't just evidence of crime. It was a live feed of a murder conspiracy unfolding in real time. They needed to act, but act quietly. If the firm realized EncroChat had been compromised, they'd vanish. Or worse, accelerate their violence. So officers built case files in silence, logging conversations, linking code names to real people, building timelines. The level of detail was chilling, one detective would later say. It was like watching assassins plan hits over text messages. By June 2020, the order came down: move. SWAT teams across Liverpool launched synchronized raids. Dozens of addresses were hit at dawn. Flashbangs, battering rams, helicopters overhead, armed officers in full gear. Among the targets, Vincent Coggins, arrested at a rented apartment tied to multiple devices. Paul Woodford, found with encrypted phones and burner sims. Bobby Jarvis, Michael Earl, Craig Cox, and Richard Caswell, all swept up in coordinated arrests. Inside their homes, police found loaded firearms, cash bundles totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds, 10+ kilos of cocaine, lists of surveillance targets, encrypted phones still active, balaclavas, gloves, and burner devices. But perhaps most disturbing of all, screenshots of EncroChat threads outlining the plan to murder Robbie Maxwell and 3 others, all still alive for now. The plan was stopped just in time. Operation Venetic had delivered what no one thought possible: the inner workings of Liverpool's most feared firm exposed. For the first time in decades, the police weren't playing catch-up. They were a step ahead, the arrests. By the time the dust settled, more than a dozen members of the Huyton Firm were in custody. Some were caught red-handed. Others were still asleep when officers kicked in their doors. All were stunned. They thought they were invisible, untouchable, protected by layers of encryption and silence. But the evidence told a different story. In interview rooms across Merseyside, detectives laid out the mountain of data retrieved from EncroChat: conversations, threats, drug orders, surveillance reports, names, addresses, photos. For the firm, there was no way out. They weren't just accused of drug trafficking. They were facing charges of conspiracy to murder, blackmail, firearms possession, money laundering, and Class A drug distribution on an industrial scale. Vincent Coggins, the self-styled kingpin of the Huyton Firm, was calm at first, cold, dismissive. But the pressure mounted when he realized that every message he thought was secret, every plan, every threat, had been recorded word for word. One message showed him instructing a hit on a man police later confirmed had no connection whatsoever to the robbery. Another discussed plans to make him scream before he dies. In court, prosecutors would later describe the messages as textbook criminal command and control, conducted through encrypted communications that gave the defendants a false sense of security. The EncroChat data was so overwhelming that many of the defendants pled guilty, hoping to reduce their sentences before trial. Others tried to fight the charges, claiming fabrication, misinterpretation, or banter. It didn't work. The digital fingerprints were undeniable. A key piece of evidence was a group chat between Coggins, Woodford, and Jarvis, in which they casually negotiated how much acid would be needed to destroy a human body. 4 liters for a body in it. Just make sure it's fresh or it won't melt right. I'm not doing pieces again. One go. Those weren't jokes. They were blueprints for murder. Meanwhile, the victims, including Robbie Maxwell and his family, were placed under protection. Authorities confirmed that the plot to kill them was active and imminent at the time of arrest. And while the robbers who actually stole the £1 million stash were never officially identified, the Huyton Firm's revenge spree had already caused irreparable damage. In trying to preserve their power, they had exposed their entire operation and brought a 20-year empire crashing down, 155 years behind bars. In late 2023, Liverpool Crown Court became the stage for one of the most consequential gangland prosecutions in UK history. The defendants, men who once ruled the streets of Merseyside, now sat in silence behind reinforced glass, flanked by armed guards. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, police officials, and families, both of victims and perpetrators. The charges were read aloud. The list was staggering. Conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, conspiracy to murder, blackmail, firearms possession, conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. The prosecution's case revolved around a single point. EncroChat didn't lie. Tens of thousands of decrypted messages were presented to the jury. Threads between Coggins and his crew discussing murder plans in shocking detail. Photos of cocaine bricks sent between dealers, blackmail demands, kill orders, and outlines of failed assassination attempts. There was no need for informants, no hearsay. The evidence spoke for itself, time-stamped, archived, and irrefutable. One by one, the ringleaders were sentenced. Vincent Dickie Coggins, 28 years. Paul Woodford, 24 years and 6 months. Edward Bobby Jarvis, 20 years. Michael Earl, 18 years. Craig Cox and Richard Caswell, 15 to 17 years each. Others received lesser but still significant sentences. In total, 9 men were jailed for more than 155 years combined. As the sentences were read out, some defendants stared blankly, others lowered their heads. A few muttered quietly under their breath. But the courtroom and the city had heard enough. This wasn't just justice for the intended victims. It was a message to criminal networks across the UK. The rules had changed. Encrypted phones no longer offered protection. Blackmail, intimidation, and violence were no longer hidden in the shadows. And even the most feared firms could fall. The judge summed it up bluntly. This case revealed a criminal structure that operated without conscience, without remorse, and without boundaries. Your actions endangered lives, corrupted communities, and nearly led to multiple murders. You will now face the consequences. For the Maxwell family, the relief was bittersweet. They had narrowly escaped a murder plot, paid ransom money they would never recover, and been dragged through a nightmare they hadn't created. The actual robbers who stole the firm's drugs were never caught. But in the end, their crime triggered something far greater: the collapse of one of Liverpool's most violent underworld dynasties, the Legacy. When the final prison door slammed shut on the last member of the Huyton Firm, something in Liverpool shifted. For decades, the firm had been a shadow power, a name whispered in fear, a force that moved quietly but ruthlessly. They didn't just sell drugs, they controlled communities, through fear, through silence, through violence that was understood but never seen. But now, that silence was broken. EncroChat changed everything. What was once the criminal world's best-kept secret became its Achilles heel. Across the UK, over 1,500 arrests were made in connection to Operation Venetic. Weapons, millions in cash, tons of narcotics. But few cases were as personal, or as terrifying, as the downfall of the Huyton Firm. The legacy of the case stretched far beyond the courtroom. For law enforcement, it proved that digital surveillance, when used correctly, could dismantle even the most insulated networks. For organized crime, it shattered the illusion of safety behind encryption. For Liverpool, it marked the fall of a group that had terrorized neighborhoods for over 20 years. But not everything was cleanly resolved. The stolen £1 million stash of cocaine was never recovered. The real culprits, the ones who robbed the firm and sparked the blood feud, vanished without a trace. It's believed they either fled the UK or were later silenced in unrelated attacks. Robbie Maxwell survived, but disappeared from public view. Some say he relocated. Others say he went underground, living in quiet exile from the city that nearly cost him his life. His father, Brian Maxwell Sr., never returned to his old neighborhood. He had lost everything: his house, his savings, his peace, just to buy a few more breaths for his son. And the people of Liverpool, they didn't rejoice, not really, because when you've lived under the thumb of gangs like the Huyton Firm, you don't cheer when they fall, you just exhale, quietly, carefully, knowing someone, somewhere, is already waiting to take their place. But for now, the streets were quieter. The messages had stopped, and the men who once planned murder through encrypted screens now sat in concrete cells, counting the years they'd never get back, all because someone robbed the wrong people and vanished without a trace.